We're going to ask our moderator tonight, Mark, to get us started and let you know what's going to be going on. Welcome to everybody. Glad everybody's here. Looks like we have quite a nice gathering. And thank you to our tech manager, Nick. Nick is going to wave to you right now so you can see who he is. And we have great big thanks for him for taking on the technical aspects. Mark, you're on.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our interfaith discussion with tonight's theme of Explore, Compare, and Discover Passover and Easter Together. I'm Mark Busbang from St. Anne's Anglican Church, and I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. Just to let you know that this evening's session will be recorded and also live streamed on Facebook. So for those of you that may be a little bit shy and may not want your face broadcast across the internet, now would be the time to turn off your camera or your cam so that it's not included in either the video recording or the live stream. So what I want to just make a little note as we begin our session, your microphones will be muted. This is mostly to prevent feedback coming in so that everybody can enjoy a good quality audio experience. And the second thing is that as the discussion progresses throughout the evening, many of you might have some questions. Feel free to go into the chat box, excuse me, and enter your questions in the chat box, and periodically throughout the evening we'll be referring back to the chat box and we'll bring forward your questions for discussion. As the evening progresses further, we're also going to be breaking out into small discussion groups and then coming back and sharing our experiences again. So I'd like to introduce you to the Reverend Canon Gary Vandermeer, who will give you a bit of an overview and start the session. Gary.
So welcome, everyone. I'm Gary Vandermeer. I'm the parish priest at St. Anne's. And Rabbi Elyse, Goldstein, and I have nurtured a friendship over several years now, and we've both involved our congregations in this. And I'm really delighted that we get to continue that this season, especially because our sacred celebrations overlap so closly. And it's a great opportunity for us to learn. What's going to happen tonight is Rabbi Elyse and I are each going to give a 15-minute segment of teaching about our holidays. And then once we've each done that, we're going to have a dialogue between us in which some of your questions will be what we will talk about. And then we'll break up into small groups and come back. When you go out into your small group, you might have a recorder record your conversation and questions, and then we'll come back at the end and hear some of the themes that come up and conclude by about 9 o'clock. And so at this point, I would like to welcome Rabbi Elyse to give us the background on Passover in your tradition.
Thank you so much. It's just fun to be together. We've had so many nice study sessions between St. Anne's and City Shul, and it's nice to have another one. And I thought that we would look a little bit at the Passover narrative and how the narrative from the Torah itself, from the 5 books of Moses, translates into our most important book of the holiday, which is the Haggadah. Just a word about the holiday before I begin and show you some text, and that is that our holiday all of our holidays begin at sundown, and so it began sundown last week, and it will end for those who keep 7 days, which is the biblically mandated portion. It will end on Wednesday night, and for those who keep 8 days, which is the extra day for those who live in the diaspora, and that's for the Reformed community, that's an optional extra day. We'll end it Thursday night. And the most obvious symbol of Passover that people might recognize is that Jews refrain from eating anything that's leavened. So no cake, no pasta, no cereal, and we only eat that flat bread, which is called matzah. Now, we don't have to eat it for 8 days. We only have to eat it at the Seder, which is the first and second night's big service. And that service takes place in the home. And so Passover is a home festival, even though the narrative is a narrative of a people. It's not a holiday that's celebrated in the synagogue. It is celebrated at home, and people will eat in a very special way and tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt around their Seder tables. So Nick, if you can put up our text. That would be great. Thank you very much. So let's take a look at how the story is framed in the Torah itself. I want to begin by saying that the Exodus narrative in the Torah is the, and maybe that should be capital, the foundational story. It's both the foundational story of Judaism and it's the foundational story in Judaism. That is, it is how Judaism becomes a religion, this whole journey from being a tribe of slaves to being a nation that is obligated in the Torah is the foundational story of how Judaism is born. And it's also the foundational text in Judaism. That is, almost all of Judaism revolves around this foundational story. Every Sabbath, Friday night and Saturday, we remember the Exodus from Egypt as a central core of our Sabbath liturgy. And when we make Kiddush on Shabbat, that is when we bless the wine on Shabbat, our Kiddush, our foundational prayer of the Sabbath, has within it a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And if I could suggest that the two foundational stories that go side by side in Judaism are the creation of the world and the Exodus from Egypt, because they're both a creation of something. One is the creation of the world for all peoples, and one is the creation of the Jewish people, which is very much a particular way of looking at ourselves. And in fact, the new month in which the Hebrew month in which Passover is celebrated, the month of Nisan, is considered to be the new year of the Jewish calendar. I know we have Rosh Hashanah in the fall, that's the new year of the whole world. But Passover is the new year of the Jewish people. And so the Exodus from Egypt is our foundational narrative, it is our foundational story. It defines what we say is Judaism, and it defines how Judaism became what it is today. So let's look at a couple of points about that Exodus narrative. I have not given you the biblical text in front of you because the biblical text about the Exodus from Egypt actually begins in the book of Genesis and goes all the way through to the book of Deuteronomy, because the Exodus from Egypt is referenced from the story of Joseph, which is the end of the book of Genesis, all the way through the conquering of the land in the book of Deuteronomy. And so the foundational story of Judaism begins with the death of Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis. Now you remember that Joseph went down to Egypt because there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and he went down to Egypt to feed his family. His family goes down to Egypt. When Joseph actually doesn't go down to Egypt on his own, Joseph goes down to Egypt as a result of his own enslavement or his own being sold by his brothers into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. And as you remember the story from Genesis, he becomes, as we say in Yiddish, a very big macher. He becomes an important figure in Egypt. He becomes almost vice vizier, vice to the Pharaoh of the time who knew Joseph and respected Joseph. The rest of Joseph's family comes down to Egypt during the famine and ends up staying there. The end of the book of Genesis is a cliffhanger because it is that a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Joseph, who was very respected in the court of Pharaoh in Egypt, and whose whole family moved down to avoid the famine in Canaan, and whose whole family settles in Egypt and becomes part and parcel of Egyptian society. The new Pharaoh arises and does not know Joseph, meaning he does not know the Jewish people, nor their contribution to the society of Egypt. Remember, it was Joseph during the years of famine in Egypt whose idea of storing the corn and storing the wheat keeps Egypt from going into utter disaster. So from that beginning, the Joseph and his family being in Egypt, and the Pharaoh not knowing Joseph, the very next part of the narrative is that the Jewish people were multiplying and were many and were numerous, and that threatened the new Pharaoh greatly. And within that story of that threatening to the Pharaoh, we have the rest of the narrative, which is that Pharaoh decides to enslave this people, the descendants of Joseph, who once were very beloved and respected in Egypt. The Pharaoh decides to enslave this people as he is now, the new Pharaoh, he is now totally threatened by them totally terrified by them and terrified by the fact that they multiply so quickly. Within that context, Moses is born. Moses is hidden because all baby boys of the Hebrew people were being destroyed. Moses is hidden, is put in a basket down the Nile, and is taken in by the daughter of his biggest enemy, that is, the Pharaoh. Now, what are the major themes? From there, you know the rest of the story. Moses is a reluctant leader. He has to be assisted by Aaron. He says, why me? Don't pick me. I don't speak well. I really shouldn't be the one. And he is the best symbol of the reluctant leader. There's a battle between Pharaoh and his gods and our God. There's a battle between Pharaoh's magicians and our Moses. Somebody throws a stick into the water, turns to blood. Moses does it and does it better. And basically what is happening is the Egyptian people see their Pharaoh as their God, as one of their gods. And Pharaoh has to be convinced by our God, by the one invisible God, that Pharaoh himself is not a God. And therefore the 10 plagues have to be visited upon Egypt because of the stubbornness of that leader. And those 10 plagues lead us to final freedom. Pharaoh says, take your people, Moses, and get out of here. And then changes his mind, follows us into the Red Sea. The Red Sea opens for us, closes on Pharaoh. And the rest of the story, which is still the narrative of the Exodus from Egypt, is that we wander through the desert for 40 years, we receive manna from heaven, and we finally receive the Torah, which is our constitution as the Jewish people. And at the end of the story, the denouement of the Exodus from Egypt is the entrance into the land of Israel. It is one big story from Joseph leaving the land of Egypt because his brothers sold him into slavery to a caravan that goes into Egypt, and us coming back to the land of Israel. Joseph leaves the land of Israel against his will. We come back to the land of Israel as a free people. That's the arc of the Exodus narrative. Now, I just want to very quickly share with you some of the lessons from the narrative that move into the Haggadah. So as I said, we celebrate Passover around the table with family and friends, not this year. Everybody did it by Zoom this year. We use a book called the Haggadah. There's many, 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 many versions of the Haggadah. They're all legitimate. You can write your own. There's hundreds of versions of Haggadahs, all sorts of Haggadahs for special themes. But every Haggadah has the same 15 rubrics of the service. That service is done around a family table. And the point of that service is to teach our children the story. These themes that I want to go over with you are the themes from the narrative itself, from the Torah, that move into the Haggadah that we concentrate on during that family Seder. First, we talk about the slavery to Pharaoh as a movement towards the freedom to keep the law. And for this, you have to just know a tiny bit of Hebrew. Our ancestors, we say, were Ovdei Kochavim. That's in the Haggadah. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshipers, Ovdei Kochavim. They worshiped the sun and the moon and the stars. We went from that avodah to avdut in Hebrew, which is slavery, and from slavery to a human being. So from slavery, if you will, or serving idols, to serving Pharaoh, to avodah, which is serving God. And you have to see this as an arc. We were not freed from slavery just to be a free people. We were freed from slavery to keep the Torah, to receive the Torah and to keep the Torah as free people, to receive the discipline of the law and to receive the relationship with God that law manifests. Second is the stubbornness of the oppressor and how history repeats itself. So we must be vigilant. There's a part in the Seder in which we all sing Vihi Sha'amda. In every generation, there's someone who rises up against us, but we trust that we will come through it. We know that the oppressors are stubborn and they harden their hearts, and history will repeat itself. The third message from the narrative that we get is that every person can be a leader and no person is a God. And that is why in the entire Passover Seder, there is no mention of Moses in the entire story or the Haggadah. While it is mentioned in the Torah, Moses is not named at any point during a Passover Seder. Next, let all who are hungry come and eat. This is the focal point of our Seder. It's said in every house, whether it's said in Aramaic or Hebrew or English. It is said in every Seder. Because we were slaves in Egypt, we know how it feels to be hungry. So we open our door, not this year probably, and we let anybody in who is hungry to come and eat. We relive to remember. In our Haggadah, we all say in every generation, a person should see themselves as if they themselves were redeemed from Egypt. So each one of us was in slavery, and each one of us has been redeemed from Egypt, and each one of us is now free. So we relive the experience every year in the Seder in order to remember it. We remember the sorrow of causing pain to another as a central part in the Seder, because we remember that the Egyptians had to suffer 10 plagues for us to go free. And then we remember that the Egyptians were drowned for us to go free. And we have sorrow when other people have to suffer because of the stubbornness of their rulers and of their leaders. And so we take 10 drops of wine from our wine cups. Every Seder will do this. Although they may do it differently, everybody will do one kind of this to diminish our joy, because our freedom was bought on the backs of the pains of others. We remember the lesson of the manna, that we had our food dropping from heaven the whole time we were wandering in the desert. And so we sing a song called Dayenu, and that reminds us that we have enough in this life. The word Dayenu means we have enough. And then we end our Seder remembering that our first exile and all our exiles lead to the homeland. And so every Seder will end by saying, next year in Jerusalem. I think this year's Seders probably said, next year in each other's homes, or next year in person. And so that is the narrative itself, from the Torah, starting with Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, and how that narrative moves into our home service, which is called the Seder. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask Reverend Gary to continue with his Easter teaching.
All right, thank you, Rabbi Elyse. I'm going to also take us through, but ours is the passion of Jesus as the foundational story of Christianity. And I'll ask Nick to put the handout up on the screen as I'm talking, and I'll walk you through how the passion of Jesus is the foundational story of Christianity. So Jesus' death and resurrection is actually the first story that was told before there were any written texts. The first Christians shared this story and the meal that Jesus shared with them. The two poles of the Christian year are Christmas and Easter. And of these two, of course, the resurrection story, and so Easter is the more ancient one. Christianity developed the Holy Week as a liturgical season, a season of worship in the church, a week, by the 4th century. And it spreads a few days of the last days of Jesus' life over 8 days of liturgical observances. And to set that in the larger context, there is a season called Lent, which is a season of fasting and penitence to prepare ourselves to take in this Holy Week story. And then there is a season of Easter of 50 days, which is a celebration of the gift of resurrection and new life that we have taken in the Easter story, and we meditate on and come to understand as a story that is life-giving for us. And the week itself begins with Palm Sunday, and Palm Sunday tells the account of Jesus coming into Jerusalem with his disciples, knowing very well that this coming into Jerusalem would lead to his death. He warns his disciples 3 times about that, and they come into the city in a kind of miniature parade of Jesus on a donkey, and people laying down their coats and branches for the donkey to walk on. This is a reference to the prophet Zephaniah, and it in a way is something that we reenact, because on Palm Sunday, we also walk in a procession. We sing all glory, laud, and honor to the Redeemer King, holding our palm branches. And in a way, we are taking up the role of the disciples. And there's a meaning that goes with this. In fact, I would draw out 3 themes. One is rejoice while you can. So it's this is the story leading up to Jesus' death. And so if you can be in a place of joy today, knowing that things are going to get harder, you really should do that. The other theme is one of picking up on the satirical efforts of earlier prophets when they did almost public theater to make their point. And there's a book, The Last Week, by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, where they talk about how Jesus's parade was an intentional mockery of Pilate coming in with the imperial guards on the other side of the city, kind of thumbing their nose at empire. And that political aspect of Christianity is one that crops up in our history when we see injustice. And the third one is actually the fickleness of the crowd, because we take the role of the crowd in the church liturgy, and we know that later on in the story, what we observe on Good Friday, the crowd will turn against Jesus. So we are recognizing in ourselves fallibility when we take on that role. The next day in our Holy Week is the Thursday. We call it Holy Thursday or Maundy Thursday. And Maundy is an English contraction of the Latin mandatum, which means commandment. And the story on this night is the supper where Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood." And many have debated where that comes from out of the Jewish tradition, but in fact, it's been so reshaped that when we have the Eucharist, we're thinking of ourselves as taking in what is the essence of what Jesus is about and what he stood for, and feeding on that spiritually and being transformed by it. But in that account also, the way John's gospel tells it, the disciples come into the room, and where there would have been a washing of dusty feet, Jesus takes on that role and washes the disciples' feet. And they initially oppose this, and Jesus does it as a kind of teaching moment where he insists that those who are great should be servants, and that servants are not greater than their master, and that they should imitate him in being servants to the needs of others. So it's a beautiful account that has descended into how Christians think about leadership, although the manifestation in our churches sometimes is far closer to the imperial than the servant leadership. So we have the Eucharist and this washing of the feet. And then the washing of the feet reading concludes with a really beautiful statement. It is this: "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So that's where mandatum or Maundy comes from in Maundy Thursday. That liturgy concludes with Jesus and the disciples leaving from the meal to go out and pray in the garden. And that is where Judas Iscariot brings the authorities that arrest Jesus. So that is Maundy Thursday. We have what's called the Garden Watch, in recognition that Jesus prayed and said, "Lord, let this cup pass from me, but if it is your will, I will do it." And so we have a vigil time in the church. People have a hard time staying for that, but the idea is that we would contemplate. We come to Good Friday, and in that Good Friday liturgy, I always point out at the beginning that the crucifixion account that we read, John's Gospel, comes from later in the first century, around the year 90. And at that point, the evangelist is making shortcuts, such as referring to the Jews, which come out of a controversy between the synagogue and the early church that is late first century. It doesn't come out of the times of Jesus, because they were all Jews at that time. And so I point out with caution that as we listen to this account, we recognize 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and the role such language has played in it. The liturgy has some reference to texts, sacred texts of the Hebrew scriptures, and you'll recognize them. So for example, the opening greeting is this: All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's Isaiah 53. And beyond it, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And what's going on here is that the followers of Jesus, they knew their scriptures. They echoed them everywhere in how they told this story. And the challenge for us then is, what do we do when the echoes go back to texts? It appears that in some of our writings, it's a fulfillment language. This was to fulfill the prophecy of. And so we have our own challenges about that, because the text has been so constructed by people to echo that for us, it's really more about a resonance with what they understood, how they told a story came out of their foundational Hebrew texts, rather than to say that the Hebrew scriptures predict that this is what should happen to Jesus. So we have some care in how we talk about that. In the Good Friday liturgy, we read the whole Passion account. That's what it's called. The account from the trial through to the crucifixion and death and burial. And we do it as a dramatic reading with the congregation taking parts, individuals taking parts, and then the whole crowd is taken up by the congregation. So we all shout, "Crucify him, crucify him." In other words, we take the part of the people who change their minds in the circumstances of crisis. And we recognize in that our own fallibility as human beings, and how we are, we don't live up to who we say we want to be. We recognize our fallibility as a way of recognizing that what's happening on the cross is actually to be God's healing of us in the ways that we are fallible. One of the most moving things in that service, the way we do it at St. Anne's, is following the reading of the Passion, we bring into the church a large wooden cross, and people take time to walk up to the cross and touch it and pray. And there's music playing at the time. There's a beautiful piece, "Were You There When They Crucified the Lord?" It's a spiritual. And often we will sing something like that. And people take time and then they walk away from the cross, and you can see the tears in many people's eyes. It's a very tangible, moving thing to touch this thing and say, "I am connected to this." And then we leave. These 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, are considered to be one church liturgy. So there's no dismissal, there's no sending away. We just leave. And then we come back on Saturday night. We come back to a darkened church. We start outside by lighting a fire. And from the fire, we light the Paschal candle, the resurrection candle, the Easter candle. And from it, our tapers, and we walk into the church in darkness. When we come into the church, and the church is candlelight everywhere, and no artificial light, just candlelight. And from that candlelight, someone, often the priest, will chant an ancient hymn that puts together what this means to us. And I'm just going to quote a few phrases from it. It's called the Exultet, which is a Latin word from the first sentence, the first phrase, which is rejoice. Rejoice, heavenly powers, sing choirs of angels, exalt all creation around God's throne. Jesus Christ, our King, is risen. Sound the trumpet of salvation. It goes on, and it actually echoes Passover language. And so this is a challenge for us, because it's where our traditions overlap. And so I'll just read a phrase out of that. The phrase is, "This is our Passover feast, when Christ, the true Lamb, is slain, whose blood consecrates the homes of all believers. This is the night when first you saved our forebears. You freed the people of Israel from their slavery and led them dry-shod through the sea. This is the night when Christians everywhere, washed clean of sin and freed from all defilement, are restored to grace and grow together in holiness." So you see, the Passover language here is being reshaped to talk about the journey that Christians are making into the resurrection, into new life. in that vigil, we have a time where we then sit in darkness with our candles and read what is called salvation history. So the accounts of creation, the Spirit moving over the water, the prophet Isaiah, "Ho, let everyone who is thirsty come and buy food without paying for it." All these beautiful images, Jonah in the belly of the fish for 3 days, that would be like types to help us to meditate on what is happening to Christ. So we sit in darkness as we hear these. The one required reading is the Israelites passing through the Red Sea. And when we get to all the lights come on and we're celebrating that the resurrection has happened, what we first hear is from Paul's letter to the Romans, that in baptism, we go down into the water the way Christ went down into the tomb, and we come up out of the waters of baptism as our new self, our old self, which is gone because we have been remade by God's gift. And so this Easter celebration happens with light, with water being poured. I get to sprinkle the cedar branch of water all over the people, and it's a great joy to me and a great nervousness to them. And it's a celebration that we think of ourselves as having died to our old selves because God has remade us into new, resurrected, transformed people. We are dismissed from the end of the 3 days, and we have a resurrection party, and we have what Mark will call medicinal things to drink and lovely food. And then we continue into the Easter season reading those accounts of the resurrection each Sunday. And those resurrection accounts, they're resurrection appearances that these disciples who were fearful and locked up in their homes encountered Jesus alive when they did not expect him to, and it gave them courage and confidence. I kind of think of the way we are confined in our homes now as the time where resurrection appearances, or the breaking up in of God's grace, will be transforming us too. And so that's the whole of Holy Week, going from the celebration of entering the city through to the celebration of the joy of the resurrection, but not avoiding the darkness of the week in between. So there you have it. There is the central observance of Christianity, the passion of Jesus.
Well, thank you so much. Before we dialogue, Reverend, let's ask if people have questions they want to use the chat function, please. Mark, our moderator, is going to read through them, and we'll take some of them, and then we will dialogue with each other as part of this section. Mark, you want to just read the first one, and then as people are thinking, they can type them in. But Nick has a good one for us to start with.
Yes, just a reminder, just in case your menu bar disappeared, if you take your mouse pointer to the bottom of the Zoom screen, your menu bar will pop up. You'll see a little box called Chat, and if you click on that thing called Chat, a chat box will come up, and then you can type in your questions. So from Nick, the question that he posts is the following question: in both traditions, there is element of reenactment, acting out the elements of the story. How do you see these rituals? Reenactment, re-experiencing of the story, recreation of the time of the story. How are these moments seen in your tradition?
Great question. Reverend, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm going to say that for me, these reenactments allow me to take into myself the reality of what that moment was about, and find in myself where I identify with that, where I feel I am part of the dynamic of that part of the story, and connects me to Jesus and the people going through that, but also as a mirror to what do I need to learn about myself while this is happening.
And for me, I have to say, in the Jewish tradition, we are constantly reliving. It's not an enactment, it's actually the real thing that's happening. So, for example, on Yom Kippur, we reenact, as it were, we are the high priest, and we go in, and have a whole ritual as if we were reliving that. And under the chuppah, under a marriage canopy, the couple is the first couple. They are the first couple in the Garden of Eden. So almost everything in Judaism is a reenactment, not really a reliving, but an actual, we were there. Because in Jewish tradition, we say every Jew was at Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. All of us were there. We just maybe don't remember who we were standing next to, but we were all there. And so when we receive the Torah again on the holiday that's coming up called Shavuot, which is the holiday that follows Passover, we're literally standing at Sinai again. So in a way, one could almost analogize it to communion. You know, it's we relive as much as humanly possible this moment, as I think Christians are reliving the Last Supper during communion. We are reliving the moment. We are so into it that there are communities, Eastern European communities and also Sephardic communities, that walk through a bathtub of water during their Seder. You know, that's their tradition, because as if they were crossing the Red Sea. Other people carry things on their shoulders around the Seder table, as if they themselves were packing for Egypt. So we're always in our history. We're always in our history.
This is a quick question from Deborah, and I think it's directed to Gary. What is the timing of the Easter Vigil? What time do you return on Sunday?
So that's a great question. Liturgically, we follow the day as it is in Judaism. So as soon as it is sunset, it is the time for the Maundy Thursday liturgy, and it is the time for the Easter Vigil. So it is now Easter as of sunset on Saturday night. It is now Christmas as of sunset on Christmas Eve. So that's how that works in the liturgy.
Great. And for Rabbi Goldstein, something that's relevant, I guess, to this current context, from Keith, I understand that the Passover means liberation to the Jewish people. Am I correct? And if so, how are the Jewish people dealing with this period of quarantine? And also the Christians are dealing with it, and also how are the Christians dealing with it at this unprecedented time in history?
Thank you. That's a great question. I have to start by saying that we all had to quickly figure out how to take this home celebration, which is generally done with lots of relatives around the table, and the whole service, the whole Seder, it's not just a meal. The whole Seder is done with many friends and family and everybody gathered. And we had to all quickly recalibrate that and readapt it in a way to screens. It was very challenging for many of us. I want to add another layer, and that is for Jews who are more observant of the traditional understanding of Jewish law. They don't use technology at all on holidays or the Sabbath. I have to say that our synagogue never uses technology on the Sabbath, and boy, is this challenging us to figure out. We have services now on Zoom every Saturday. We are a synagogue that was telling people, let your technology go for one day, 24-hour rest. You don't have to use your computers on Shabbat. And now if you don't use your computer on Shabbat, you can't come to services. So Keith, that's what happened for us. We had to have our Seders across continents and across time zones, and figure out how to do this whole 15 rubric service with everybody else mute except the person doing it. So we are waiting for liberation from this quarantine, but we're taking the quarantine seriously, as everybody should.
Okay, next question. These are both traditions that are clearly have very complex meanings. How are the participants helped to understand these meanings? Or does it become clear from the rituals or services themselves?
I can quickly answer that, and I'd be interested in hearing what Reverend has to say. A lot of the Seder is explaining what the Seder is. You know, so a Seder participant is going to hear, we do this because, and it's written right into the Haggadah. But so much of Jewish tradition, and if you're Jewish, you'll understand this, Judaism is a religion of skill. It's why we start teaching kids when they're very little how to do Jewish. It's more important to know how to do Jewish than what Judaism believes. And the Seder is a really good example. There's a lot of symbolism. What do the matzahs mean, you know, and what is that Seder plate in the middle mean? Now, the Haggadah itself explains, but if you don't read every part of the Haggadah, if you say, oh, let's skip this part, or let's move on to the next part, you're going to get to this part and say, what are we doing? Why are we eating this bitter herb? Why are we eating this flat bread? And so we try very hard to put those explanations in as part of the liturgy, but it doesn't always come across, and sometimes people will stop. The whole point of Passover is for the children to ask questions. You know, you might have heard we asked the 4 questions as part of the Seder. The point of the questions is everybody around the table is supposed to ask a question, right? And so it's good. It's good if you don't know why we're eating matzah. Someone at the table is supposed to stop and ask the leader, wait a second, why are you eating this stuff, right? And so the whole point of the Seder is to stop worrying about what the book says and ask a lot of questions about what the book says.
So I'd like to answer that one as well, but I think I want to start back from Keith's question and say how are we dealing it with this in the time of the virus, because Christian community is really built around coming together in the church in liturgy. And so for us being isolated like this, what we're missing is that sense of communing. Like the Eucharist is called communion, and we're communing with God, but there is an element of communing with each other that we don't have when we're not assembled all together in the same place as the congregation. And so a lot of what we've been trying to figure out is how do we have that sense of being connected, of relationship while we're in our homes. And so the experience that we have is a 15-minute video of some aspects of the worship, and then being on Zoom together and figuring out how to replenish the intimacy that has been lost of being in community together. One of the gifts of it, though, is the liturgy is treated as drama. It actually doesn't do its own explaining. It unfolds like a play. And so I've relied on the sermon or a piece in the newsletter or something we call Christianity 101 to do that teaching, because it's so hard to do that while having the liturgy be a drama. And one of the gifts of this experience of being at the smaller level of one-on-one intimacy on Zoom has been, I'm just finding I'm naturally teaching as I go, explaining as I go. And it's allows us to go back almost into the early house churches from before Christianity was legalized, where they did talk in family groups, almost like what you're describing, to explain to each other what Christianity was. And we've lost that with Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. This big thing that we've ended up doing through the centuries has taken away the capacity of the liturgy to teach while doing it. And so there are some real opportunities right now in how we are in our isolation.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary. Just keeping an eye on the time, I think we're just going to move on to the next section. And I believe this is the dialogue section between yourself, Gary, and Rabbi Goldstein.
So for this dialogue between us, I have a particular question in mind, and I hope we can both kind of confer on this one. And that is the historicity of the events important or crucial, or is it symbolic? How do you handle historicity?
I'm gonna answer that question in a very Jewish way. I'm gonna answer the question with a question. Answer question for the question. And I'm gonna just toss a question back to you, and then we'll talk about both. I'm very moved by what you talked about, that early Christianity was in small family groups, and that really reminds me of that Passover Seder around the Seder table. And I do want the people who are with us tonight to know that Reverend Gary has come to our family Seder more than once, and that has meant a lot to us. And I've been at the church for Christmas and Easter, and that has meant a lot to me as well. But here's the question. I grew up in a neighborhood where people had Easter dinner, where that was like part of what you did for Easter. It wasn't a lot about, you know, Easter bunnies and finding chocolate eggs or whatever. I think my Christian friends went to church and then they had Easter dinner, and that was a very big part of the holiday for them. And it reminded me of our holiday. Having the Seder around the table was so central. So would you talk a little bit about that tradition and where that's gone? And then you answer that, and then I'll talk about historicity, and then we're going to throw it to them.
Okay. I want to acknowledge the reality that if I looked around our church congregation, the number of people that are in nuclear families are no longer the majority. Society has changed in many ways, and there's an article by David Brooks in The Atlantic about the nuclear family, and going back and looking at how for most of history, intergenerational families and families that had relatives and single people that lived in the family was really the norm. And so we're living at a very different time. I live on my own. My sense of Easter has been, okay, this is our time to come together, my mother and my sisters and I, and we couldn't do that. I had a meal by myself on Easter, but we talked to each other, we phoned each other. The sense of making sure that you did something that said you were connected was very much part of the Easter experience for me.
Thank you for that. And that reminds me to remind people that it's the same in our community. Many people are not in the typical, you know, nuclear family at all. And one thing that people have developed is families of choice that they've done Seder with. There's a family that we're friends with, we've done 25 years worth of Seders with. And so we build our own families to do Seder with through the years as well. Your question about historicity is one that I'm going to throw to the group to discuss in a moment, but let me just say one thing about that. For those who are watching on Facebook Live, we're going to be breaking up into small breakout rooms soon, and that unfortunately is not possible for you to join into on Facebook Live. Then we'll come back and hear what different groups had to say, and we'll wrap up. So if you want to hang out on Facebook for about 10 or 12 minutes and come back to us, we will wrap up and you'll be able to hear that. Also, for those who are on Facebook Live, I don't know if you can submit a question to us. I don't really know how to do that, and I guess we're not going to figure that out tonight. So if you have a question on Facebook Live, think about it and get it to us by email some other time. Sorry about that.
I think I can see the comments on Facebook Live, so I'll pass those along.
Oh, that would be wonderful. If there's comments on Facebook Live, Nick, and you could put them on the chat function here, or questions, we can involve those people who are watching on Facebook Live as well, and special welcome to them. Glad that they're with us. So Reverend Gary has asked me about historicity, and I have to begin by saying, I think for both of our traditions, that's a really hard question, because people are constantly asking me, did the Exodus from Egypt really happen? Did 600,000 Hebrews march through the desert? You know, archaeology doesn't have artifacts from that Exodus. I can't show you the sandals that 600,000 people wore as they walked through the desert, and I can't find you, you know, pot shards from then. And so people say, oh, you know, the Exodus from Egypt, maybe it didn't really happen. And my answer to that is always very simple. There's two kinds of truths. One is truth with a capital T, and one is truth with a small t. If you are asking me if the Bible is true with a small t, that means scientifically correct, everything happened exactly the way the Bible is saying it, then I have to say that's a question of faith, and I can't answer that. Each person has to answer that themselves, and it depends on how literalist you are in terms of your belief in the Bible. But if you ask me, is the Torah true with a capital T? That is, does the Torah contain these great, deep truths that the Exodus story is founded on, and that the Exodus story continues to teach us, right? Go down Moses and say, let my people go. This becomes the mantra of freedom for other peoples throughout the world, throughout history. If our story can be a template for liberation from bondage, and I don't care if that's physical bondage, spiritual bondage, emotional bondage, financial bondage, whatever kind of bondage people experience, if our narrative can help people see a liberation aspect in that darkness, can see some light in that darkness, then it's historical for me, meaning it's epic, meaning it might not be historically true, but it has an epic aspect to it. Reverend, do you want to answer that?
I do. So what I would say about that is I grew up in a tradition that was closer to a literal belief in the stories. And that was a real challenge for me when I became a questioning teenager. And the questions actually were way back earlier in the story, like how could the creation literally happen in 7 days? And it moved on through into adulthood of people asking, well, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Like what kind of body? How do you know that's true? And so I have come to appreciate that that within our Christian family, there are those who need the literal story. And there are others who prefer the story to be symbolic. And there is a whole range in between those two things. And they're all part of the family. And so I try to be really careful not to say this is the only way. The Anglican Church is not a tradition that says this is the only way to think. In fact, that's one of the gifts of this tradition.
Great, beautiful.
Our group had a very interesting discussion, and we talked about the idea that these are both beginnings in different ways, and that they renew who we are by taking us back to those beginnings, even though none of them happen at the sort of start of the story. And we spoke about the sense that there's something sort of continually happening, that we keep plugging back into this stuff that's sort of old, but also constantly contemporary, and that was shared by both traditions.
Nice.
Thank you for sharing. Some other brave volunteer from one of the other groups. How would you like to share a moment? Anybody want to raise their hand?
Jeremy Weeks is
Jeremy?
Yes, hi. Yes, I think it was a general agreement with all our participants that we didn't really need signs. We didn't, because we agreed that it was so long ago, there was very little archaeological proof that these things happened. But I think we took the rabbis the truth with a capital T approach, as opposed to the truth with a small t. And you know, we think it doesn't really matter that these things can't be proven. We think because there has to be a grain of truth in some of them, we don't think they could have lasted, the tradition could have lasted that long. Whether it's by, you know, a higher power invested in us that we believe these things. We realize that in both our religions, there's a fundamentalist part that would have these to be true no matter what. The flood was brought up by one participant that, you know, there was scientific proof that they're in that general area of the Bosphorus. There was a flood maybe 4,000 years ago, which would tie in maybe to the story of the flood in the Bible. But we had a good discussion. Everybody participated. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. And now we have Janet Mitchell.
So I'm looking for you, Jan, to try and unmute you. There you go. You're unmuted. Yeah.
Okay, hi. So there wasn't an awful lot different from what's previously been reported. We all agreed that there did not seem to be any actual contradiction in the stories, and that it was reasonably consistent. And even if there were differences, doesn't really matter, which is a question for eternity, I guess. Keith also put it in a way that says, you know, the literal and the symbolic of the stories can work together. And that's basically what we said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. Anybody else would like to share?
Dave Röder raised his
David?
hand.
Oh, that's wonderful. David?
Yes, hello. We might have used different words, but the capital T and the small t truth kind of came through in our discussion. I guess I would say we all felt we could understand the essence of truth without having to accept the minutia of all the details, especially since we figured it was written by writers in a time for an audience, and it helped from a historical perspective to understand that audience. We appreciate Rabbi and the Reverend teaching us about what that would have meant then to help us interpret what it means now. That was the only other additional thing I think we came up with.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. So we've heard from 4 groups. Nick, you're going to have to help me on this one. Was there 4 breakout groups or 5?
I think our group hasn't reported yet.
Oh, thanks, Max.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, so I think our group was in a consensus about the believe more in the capital T truth than the small t. But we also talked about how these stories have a power in our mythologies, I guess, or our faith traditions, and I mentioned, going to the Holy Land and to Jerusalem and just feeling really moved by these places, even though one is skeptical about, well, did this really happen here, and did it really happen at all, and whatnot? But still, they're so ingrained in your personal story that they have this power. So I think that's about all I can remember of our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Max. I think we've heard back from all the groups now, so I'm going to turn it back over to Reverend Gary or the Rabbi.
Okay, so let me start. This is where we are coming towards the end of our conversation, and I want to remind everybody about what this friendship is about. When we first reached out to have a friendship between St. Anne's and City Shul, we were not looking to make others be like us. We were looking to appreciate each other and to have genuine friendship. And genuine friendship means we are truly beside each other. We think of ourselves as siblings in solidarity, and we want to understand how our fellow siblings think, what they care about, and we want to be able to share the essence of who we are and what we care about. It's how we know each other and love each other. And so this friendship that we have been developing between St. Anne's and City Shul is about common humanity in the face of the divine. And I would like to invite people to continue in this friendship with us as we continue to have that be the purpose of our coming together. There are many things that will enrich us out of that, enjoying each other's customs, enjoying each other as people. In a strange way, when we've had the monthly St. Anne's community dinner and we've had people from City Shul help with the dinner, I've sometimes scratched my head and said, well, which ones are the St. Anne's people and which ones are the City Shul people? I've stopped seeing the difference and see the humanity, and I really love that. And I'll turn it over now to Elyse to say a few more concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Gary. I wanna also talk about the beginning of this relationship, but slightly differently. It's very interesting, and I think I should share with people that the Reverend and I became friends over a long dialogue as to Passover and Easter's commonality, and what does it mean for a Christian community to be interested in how Passover looks today as opposed to how it might have looked in Jesus's time. And that dialogue began as a dialogue about Christian seders or mock seders or churches doing seders. And it developed into a very strong and deep conversation about, as you said, Reverend Gary, appreciating each other's customs without appropriating them. And understanding that, as Martin Buber says, who are real lovers? Those who cherish the other's otherness. And we've developed a modus operandi for looking at our two faiths and appreciating and loving where they stand on their own. Not one faith as an adjunct to the other, not one faith as superseding the other, and not one faith as better, worse, or in any way judged by the other. And that's true interfaith friendship for us to be able to say, we appreciate your customs, but we're not going to take them. We're not going to use them. We're not going to imitate them. They're your customs and they are your history. And for both of us, for both of us to be dedicated to that. And it's been quite a journey and a wonderful journey. And we've learned a lot along the way. And so I know that our holiday ends for some people on Wednesday night and for other people on Thursday night. And we will go back to our very bready bread and enjoy it very much. But the lessons that we've gained through this very unusual Passover of isolation will stay with us for a really long time. So I'm going to wish everyone shalom and peace and a blessed rest of your holiday season, and a dedication to continuing this friendship for as long as we all can. And Gary, I'm going to toss it to you to say final goodbyes, and then I'll do thank yous.
All right, so I want to, in our final goodbye, just remind everyone that we are on a trajectory of friendship, which has gone from talking about some lighter things and comparing them to getting to the heart of our traditions together. And it's as if our friendship is involving growing trust. To the point where things that we might feel unsafe talking about, we now know each other so well that we're okay talking about them with each other. And this momentum is really something to treasure. It didn't come out of sitting together here tonight in one session, and it will take us to new places in the future as we continue to do this. And I'm very excited about that, and I hope that you are as well. So we hope that you'll come and do this with us again.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us, whether you're on Facebook Live or on Zoom, or you'll be watching this later on as a recording. I want to give a special thank you to Nick from City Shul and Mark from St. Anne's, who have been wonderful to work with. They have helped us through the technological aspect of this and make sure everything is really smooth and clear, and the logistical aspect of it. And it's been great to have somebody from each congregation so involved. Thanks everybody for coming. And I wish you a very, very good week. Stay strong, stay healthy, and stay at home. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.